When it comes to fat loss, we often talk about going slow, being patient, using a small calorie deficit, and playing the long game. And for most people, most of the time, that is the right call. But for some of you, the long game is what is holding you back, because you get about 6 weeks in, maybe you get bored, maybe you start to drift off track, and then you quit. And so it becomes an adherence issue. Today, I'm making the case that for some, a shorter, stricter, more aggressive cut, aka rapid fat loss, can sometimes beat dragging out a moderate deficit for several months. Who it actually works for, what the research says about sparing your muscle when you are dieting hard, and the line between a smart aggressive cut and a crash diet, which are not the same thing. Welcome to Wits and Weights, the show that puts a popular piece of fitness advice under the microscope, finds the hidden reason it doesn't work, and gives you the deceptively simple fix that does. I'm your host, certified nutrition coach, Philip Pape, and today we are revisiting rapid fat loss. If you've been around this show for a while, or really around any evidence-based corner of the fitness world over the past few years, you've probably absorbed the key message for successful fat loss, and that is slow and steady, use a moderate or small deficit so that you don't lose too much muscle and you can stick with it. Lose maybe a half pound to a pound a week. It depends on your size and your metabolism. Be patient. You want to build the habits. You want to play the long game. And I've said that versions of that myself, right? The long game is sometimes the fastest game because for many, if not most people in most situations, that's the right call. Now, recently we did do an episode about mini cuts and mini bulks where I push you more on the aggressive side to say that some people benefit a little bit from short duration fat loss phases that are a little more aggressive. And today we're going to go even further than that. We're going to get a little uncomfortable and poke at our own orthodoxy. And in reality, I've talked a lot about nonlinear approaches and the fact that everyone responds to different things, both physically and psychologically. And so that's why it's good to have a spectrum. So the slow or moderate approach, it rests on an assumption, and that is that the hardest part of dieting is sustaining it, right? When we say sustainability, that's what we mean. Adherence. Can you stick with it to be successful? And so then the move here is, well, let's make it a little gentler. Let's make it a little longer. And for certain types of people in certain situations, that assumption doesn't always hold up. And for those people, going longer sometimes kills the diet, or it causes you to bounce back and forth and never really quite get what you want out of it. Now, to be really clear up front, because I think this gets highly weaponized online on social media, I'm not here to sell you on crash dieting. I'm not saying that this is at all something a beginner should do. I'm not telling you, hey, eat 800 calories a day, even though that number could be the number for you at a very short duration based on your current maintenance calories. But I'm not just going to make a blanket statement. What I am going to do is take a protocol that actually exists, that has structure, that has evidence behind it, show you who it fits and who it doesn't, especially for those of you who, hey, maybe you're perimenopausal, postmenopausal, and you have recovery issues. Maybe you're on the older side. We really want to understand what you have been doing in your lifestyle to this point and what you're doing right now to see if it works. It's all about context. And then I want you to stick around to the end because I'm going to give you a simple rule at the end for how to set your rate of loss on any cut. It's a very simple way that I use with clients and our members in Eat More Lift Heavy, where you can get a little creative about how you approach the beginning of the diet and then as you get into it. So we'll talk about that at the end. You could use that on your next fat loss phase. But for today's episode, here's what we're going to cover. The first thing is why slow is usually the default, but then when it stops working for a subset of you out there. What an actual structured aggressive cut or rapid fat loss phase looks like, because you've probably heard of lots of folks out there, like Lyle McDonald, for example, and different protocols. I'm just going to keep it simple and straightforward. I'm going to give you a version that has the protein sparing aspect to it and built-in refeeds, not a let me starve you to death version, because there's a difference. Also, what does the research say about losing fat quickly but not losing muscle? And then I think maybe the part that matters the most here is when is an aggressive cut a bad idea and how to tell if you are the exception to that rule. So I know it sounds like a lot, but it's all going to come together. I want to start with why slow and sustainable is kind of the default and not create any straw men here, right? The case for moderate fat loss is a really, really strong one that I strongly advocate for a lot of folks. And when I start with a person who's never quite done this before, that's generally the approach we take. However, the duration itself can still be its own challenge in terms of a variable, even when you are going slowly. So when you lose weight slowly, when you have a smaller deficit, we know that it's much more easy to hold on to most, if not all, of your muscle. It's easier. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. Conversely, going aggressive doesn't mean you're going to lose muscle, right? I want to be clear about that. There is a classic study by Garth in 2011 that gets cited a lot where they took elite athletes and they split them into a slow fat loss group, losing about 0.7% of body weight a week. So that's 0.7%. And then a fast group losing 1.4% per week. And it was the same total weight loss. Both groups are lifting weights, both eating, enough protein. The slow group increased their lean mass by about 2%. The fast group basically flat on that without gaining any lean mass. So the slower the fat loss, the assumption is, or the conclusion is, that it's more sparing of your muscle. And you might even gain a little bit if you're newer to this. And that's not super uncommon when we look at body recomp scenarios. Beyond that, slower dieting seems to protect your metabolic rate a bit better. And it's just a function of the aggressiveness. It's not like a magical thing. In other words, the math all works out whatever way you look at it, because what you're trading off by going slower is just slower fat loss, right? So if we look at, for example, this 2020 meta-analysis by Ashtari Larkey, they pooled a bunch of the research together and found that when you match total weight lost, the gradual dieters, those who take it slowly, held on to about 97 calories a day more of their resting metabolic rate than people who went very fast, right? So 97 calories. And it's not that big of a difference, maybe. And, it depends on how big of a difference the aggressiveness was here. But we tend to see a difference. And it kind of makes sense. But again, you're trading off faster fat loss, right? Then there's the behavior part of this, which is probably the most important, almost bar none the most important from everything I've seen. And that is that a moderate deficit is easier for people to deal with their real life, right? You can go out to dinner. You can practice the skills of eating well, portioning your food, hitting your protein, navigating like the planning for restaurants, restaurant menus, going to parties, social events, all that stuff that you need, those skills that you need forever, those skills that are honestly the bread and butter of what we tend to help people with in our programs as well, because that's what pays off. That's what allows you to get that independence and know how to sustain and live at maintenance and have that long game, right? And that is the good argument for this. And then when you want to do a fat loss phase, it's just a matter of scaling some of those things, bringing down the carbs a bit, maybe shifting the nutrition density of the foods. So why am I doing this episode? Well, we've covered rapid fat loss a couple times in the past, and it comes up a lot. And there's a lot of assumptions and misconceptions about it. If we think of slow and sustainable, it assumes that the binding constraint, right? The thing most likely to fall down in this chain of variables, let's say, is your ability to keep going, your adherence. So then the fix is we need to make it easier, make it gentler, make it longer. And for a lot of people, that works really well. But for some of you, that's not the constraint. For some of you, patience, engagement, interest is the constraint. You start really strong, things start to move, you're very excited and motivated, and then usually around week 6, I will say, about a month and a half in, the novelty is off, the progress slows down, and you start to get frustrated, you start to drift, your tracking gets sloppy. I see this all the time. People are like, oh, I'm sorry, I actually haven't tracked for the last 2 weeks. Okay, what are you doing, man? Or woman, what are you doing? The weekend bleeds into the week, especially if you're doing the same calories every day. So it gets kind of boring. And eventually you're not really dieting. You're kind of thinking about dieting, and maybe you're tracking, maybe not. And you're kind of trying to, but you're not quite doing it. And you're sort of at maintenance now, right? So for that person, the long moderate deficit is not the best choice. Also, there's a corner case of folks like, for example, some women I've had as clients. Maybe they have thyroid issues, maybe they don't, but they're over responsive when they go on a diet where their metabolism drops pretty quickly. And then they have to keep up with it by trying to cut calories again. And it's this frustrating thing of, oh my gosh, I can never actually lose weight. And it's not that you can't, it's just you have to go more aggressively. Sometimes you have to go way more aggressively, but for a short duration. And this actually aligns with some of the research Dr. Bill Campbell has done lately, like very recently down in South Florida, putting women on a very, very aggressive deficit with a lot of movement. Now, his protocol is extreme, but it's extreme for a purpose. It's kind of to prove out whether, a woman who has the menopausal symptoms more severe than other women can actually lose weight. And of course they can, right? Like if you just starve yourself, you're going to lose weight, but that's not necessarily the way we want to do it. But it gives us a lot of clues as to what might work. So the just go slow can be a problem for a subset of people. And again, staying engaged is very important here. So ironically, sustainability for some means going faster than getting out. So getting in, getting out, and doing that multiple times over the year, over several years. So now let's talk about the aggressive cut, okay? If longer is a problem, then the alternative is shorter and more aggressive. So again, we've got a couple of variables we can play with. The duration, how aggressive, like how big of a calorie deficit, which means how little are we going to eat technically, and then the variety within that. So like, do you shift the calories around and all of that, okay? And we're actually going to hit on these. So I don't mean wing it and starve. I don't mean do Optavia or whatever it's called, 800 calories a day of packaged foods that they ship. Like none of that nonsense. I mean an actual structured protocol, because structure is the point. Planning ahead is the point. Being in control is the point. We've talked on this show about how two groups of people who have refeeds, so in other words, they are dieting and then let's say on the weekend they eat more, the people that treat it as a cheat meal will actually be less successful than the people who are completely on top of planning it out. Like they plan it as simply a higher day that's a refeed. It's not a cheat day. It's not a, let's just have fun and eat whatever. And we see that. So there is a psychology behind this. And this idea has been around in the evidence-based world for a long time. Lyle McDonald wrote about it, a version of rapid fat loss years ago. A lot of people reference him. A lot of my clients are into his stuff. He's great. He's very grumpy, grouchy guy. You got to love him. And a lot of what he says holds up and are great models for how to do this. We've also done our own rapid fat loss challenges and episodes. And I have a guide based on when Dr. Bill Campbell was on here, and I sort of did an experiment based on one of his protocols. So I'm going to walk you through that today. But it doesn't matter whose protocol you use. The principles are what matter in terms of doing a smart, aggressive cut versus like a crash diet. Okay, so let's go through those. Principle 1 is you're going to have to go into a very aggressive deficit, yes, which means you're just going to eat a lot fewer calories, but you are going to anchor it to a really high amount of protein. Okay, protein and fibrous foods is the second piece of that, but it's really about the protein sparing your muscle and then eating in a way that minimizes the hunger, but you can't get rid of the hunger at this level. You're going to have hunger, okay? The version that I like is you go into about a 45% deficit. So you take your maintenance calories. That's the amount of calories you actually burn, which you need to know that. So you have to be tracking ahead of time and be kind of at maintenance for a while before you do this. And I recommend the tool Macro Factor. It's my favorite app. Use code WITS and WAITS, all one word, get a 2-week free trial, try it out, okay? You need your maintenance calories, and then you go 55% of that, so a 45% deficit. So it's about half. I mean, you could say roughly half, but it's a little more than that. So if you burn 2,500 calories, you're going to be around 1,375 on your deficit days. And that's very aggressive. Now, a lot of you are starting way lower than that. You're starting at 1,800 calories, and now you're going to go down to something like 950, right? Or maybe even lower than that. And that's why you could be at 700 or 800 calories for an individual, but that's the point is it's going to be extremely short. Here's what keeps it from being a crash diet. You're going to set your protein really high. You're going to set it to at least a gram per pound of body weight, but it could go higher, 1.2, 1.3, 1.5. It could be pretty much exclusively protein, things like white fish and shrimp and chicken breast, right? And vegetables. And I know it almost sounds like paleo or something like that. But that's the point. It's very, very short. You're going to keep those amino acids flooding in. You're going to keep strength training. And that is going to hold on to the muscle because that's what we want to do. We want to lose fat and not muscle. Principle 2. So principle 1 is the protein. Principle 2 is We're going to keep the carbs in, but we're going to use it as refeeds for the most part. Depending on how many carbs you have to play with during the week, you might have some carbs during the week, but you're going to be eating mostly fibrous vegetables, and including a little bit of fruit is what I would recommend. So when we look at starvation diets or crash diets, oftentimes they just cut carbs, right? Things like keto, and that can be counterproductive. We know carbs are muscle sparing. They give you a little bit of energy, but they are going to be highly limited. Let's just admit it, because you're taking up most of the diet with protein. When you run out of carbs, your body's going to start pulling from other sources. So it's going to try to pull from fat, maybe a little bit from protein, converting to glucose, and it's not going to rebuild muscle. In other words, muscle protein breakdown outpaces muscle protein synthesis. So it's not that it's like eating your muscles if you are lacking in protein and carbs. It's just that your body will not have what it needs to rebuild the muscle. So we do keep carbs in the picture. They end up moderate to low, just like the fat ends up being pretty low. Protein is taking up the vast majority of your calorie budget. And then the principle 3 we're going to get to now with refeeds, that's where you're going to really take advantage of carbs. So principle number 3 is schedule built-in refeeds. And the way I run it, you go 4 days in a deficit, then 1 day in a refeed, 4 days in a deficit, 1 in a refeed, 4 more days in a deficit, and you're done. So that's 14 days. That include 2 refeeds. Now, there are different protocols. Again, Lyle McDonald has his protocol. You can look it up. There's lots of different ways to do that. Some people get creative and mix it around. It's fine, right? Some people stretch it out a little bit, and they might do 4 days, 2 days, or they might do a typical 7-day period of 5 days, 2 days. That's also pretty common. So on the refeed days, what do? Well, you bump your calories back up to maintenance almost entirely with carbs. And, I like carbs like fruit and starches, rice and things like that are pretty easy to just jack up carbs and consume them, because you actually might, even though you're probably hungry and you're looking forward to the food, you also don't want to stuff yourself and get distended and feel like really terrible. So you tend to go and pick, the right types of carbs that kind of balance a sweet spot between satiety and ease of consumption. And so your refeed days are up at your maintenance calories. So if you were burning 2,500 calories and you're dieting on, what did we say, 13 something, now you're going back to 2,500 on those days. Now, there are some camps that say, look, if you don't feel like you need all that amount, go part way there, go 2/3 or 80% of the way there. You're going to have to experiment with yourself to see if that gets you all the benefits or not. For some people, it's not enough, and then they feel like they've never quite had a relief. For others, that's actually beautiful, because then it actually gives them a little bit more of a deficit as part of the process, right? The goal here is top off your muscle glycogen. It kind of really gives you a little boost for the next training day, but mainly it gives you a psychological breather, a day that you can look forward to, but in a planned way, not in a cheat way. And that helps you get through the 2 weeks. 2 weeks doesn't sound like a lot on a podcast, but when you're actually in this thing, this is a challenging thing to do. And by the way, you could stretch this out to 3 weeks in different ways. You can have a slightly less aggressive deficit. You can have 2 extra refeed days in there. There's different ways to do this. The 4th principle is the training, the strength training, right? And we've talked about this in the past. When you go into fat loss, a lot of people want to train a different way. You want to do lighter, more reps, add a bunch of cardio, etc. No, you're not going to have much energy. So the best way to burn fat, to hold on to your muscle, is a high stimulus, keeping the intensity or the weight on the bar or on the dumbbells or machines high. So whatever you're already doing, probably just keep doing that, because we're only talking about 2 weeks. We're not trying to hit PRs necessarily. So rep range, auto-regulated type programming tends to work well here. But for most of you, you're probably already doing something like that, and you might lose a touch of strength because of the low energy. But, you hit it hard, get close to failure like you normally would, even if it's a few reps less. Keep the weight up there, keep the load up there. Don't deload, don't bring it down. In fact, that's the worst time to combine with the deload. I always tell people when they're going to deload in their normal course of their lifestyle, that's actually a good time not to be dieting. That's actually a good time to eat more, not the opposite. But anyway, heavy lifting, high protein, keep that muscle, burn the fat. That's the engine that's going on here. So 2 caveats here so that I don't oversell this to people. The first one is that when you run this, and your scale is probably going to drop a lot in the first few days. It may or may not. People respond differently, but if it does, most of that it's going to be water and stored carbs that are leaving your body. The real fat loss over say the 2-week protocol we're talking about here is more like at most 3 to 5 pounds. Now that is excellent for a mere 14 days. That really is. And that's why you can string together, say, 3 of these in a year, and now you've got 9 to 15 pounds of fat loss within that year just for 6 total cumulative weeks of dieting. That's not bad at all. That's kind of what we're going for. The second thing is this is a tool. This is not a lifestyle. It makes your overall life more sustainable for some people to be able to only have the 2 weeks of aggressive dieting. But the dieting itself is a very defined, structured block with a start and finish. And then you come back out to maintenance deliberately. You don't extend it. One of the biggest mistakes people make is, hey, Philip, I'm feeling okay. I just got some fat off. Should I keep going? I'm like, probably not. Probably not. Can you extend it by 1 week? Maybe. You've got to look at your biofeedback, your performance, all of that stuff. Maybe, but don't push it too hard or you're going to start losing muscle. It's going to start messing with your hormones, all that other stuff. So I just gave you the principles. I just gave you the broad numbers. If you want it spelled out, like exactly what do I eat on each day? How do I do the math and all that? I do have a guide, my rapid fat loss guide. I've had it for a while. I'll put the link in my show notes. If you go to witsandweights.com/free, you can see all of my guides, including rapid fat loss, but I will put the link in the show notes to the rapid fat loss guide. This is one of the more detailed guides I have. It's Google Doc that actually walks you through everything and step by step. It does the calorie math. It gives you the protein, gives you the structure, the 4-1-off structure, tells you even how to set it up in macro factor. There's lookup tables. You can find your body weight, maintenance calories. There's a whole bunch of really good stuff in there. Again, I'm saying that rapid fat loss is not for everyone, but it's good to look at it and see what it would take for you to do it. And if you are one of the people that is a good fit for this, we're going now to talk about who that is so that you could just be educated and make the right choice. Okay. So again, go to witsandweights.com/free if you want to find the rapid fat loss guide or click the link in the show notes. So the protocol is very structured, but does rapid fat loss work as you would expect? Can you actually hold on to your muscle? Because you've probably heard, if I go more than 500 calorie deficit, I'm going to start losing my muscle. No, there's a dose response factor and there's also a high training stimulus factor. I will say generally what I've found is if people are really consistent at training hard with the proper effort, okay, just like we talked about, I think it was our last episode about what actually builds muscle. If you are doing that with enough volume and effort, you have a lot of leeway on dieting if you keep the duration short. Even if you are a 45, 50-year-old woman with declining progesterone and estrogen, all the fear-mongering out there about menopause, you can't lose weight anymore and this and that. If you do this, you can have very good results. And this may be what you need as either a jump start or a little bit of, boost to get it done if you do it right. There are 2 things it depends on, the protein and the lifting. So it really comes down to that. And that can be challenging though. The lifting, not so much once you get into it, like you just keep doing it, but hitting that amount of protein when it's mostly just that protein, you've got to be very dialed in. Like you can't be eating ribeye and 80% ground beef for the most part during this phase. You could eat scallops and seafood. Seafood's great, like whitefish, chicken breast, things like that. Some forms of pork, maybe. But the reason the protein is so important, we know this from studies. There's one back in 2016 by Longland where they took young men, they put them on a 40% calorie deficit, which is aggressive by any standard. They did it for 4 weeks. They did hard resistance training and intervals. And then they split them by protein. So one group had moderate protein intake. One had about up to 2.4 grams per kilogram. So the high protein group on the 40% deficit gained 2.5 pounds of lean mass and lost 11 pounds of fat. So they actually body recomped on a huge deficit. The lower protein group just held on to their muscle and they lost less fat. So it's the same deficit, different body composition outcome. The only difference was the protein and the fact that they trained hard. And I will say, we're going to do another episode soon, digging into that whole protein phenomenon about how magic can occur when you increase your protein in terms of fat loss, even when you're in a deficit, or I should say, even when you're in a surplus, and then all of a sudden you start to lose fat. And it's like, this doesn't make sense, does it? Based on calories in, calories out? It does, but it's kind of a secondary effect that occurs on the energy outside of the equation. So anyway, protein is very important. And the muscle loss that everyone is worried about, it's not really about the size of the deficit. It's whether you are lifting hard, keeping the protein high, and keeping the duration short. And there's a whole body of work from Eric Helms that goes back to 2014, so a decade, where he basically, just to paraphrase, the leaner you are and the more aggressive the deficit, the more protein you need. So in practice for a lifter, that's where we get to the gram per pound of body weight. Now, the minimum you really need in general is like 0.6, 0.7. It's not nearly that much. But when you're in an aggressive deficit, that's where we need to create a higher floor. So the floor I use in the protocol is just 1, but I've definitely seen people be more successful jacking that up. Okay, jacking that up. It helps with satiety and all the other things as well. And it really does move the needle on body composition for some people in a surprising way. Now, remember earlier I mentioned the difference between those two groups with the aggressive versus not aggressive, and their metabolism dropped faster in the more aggressive group. Well, in that study, the problem is the rapid groups were usually, they didn't have very high protein, and in many cases, they weren't lifting weights. So of course, they're going to lose muscle. So a lack of protein in training will itself accelerate your drop in metabolism as well. And look, a lot of you, when we talk, forget rapid fat loss, just talk about life in general. You get into your 40s, 50s, we're like, oh, my metabolism's not what it used to be. That's what's happening. You're losing muscle mass. You need more protein as you age, not less. And you probably didn't have much to begin with. If you're not even lifting weights, that's the biggest piece of all. That's the biggest piece of all. So whoever you are, lifting weights, eating enough protein, it solves most of these issues, guys. All right. Now, what about the refeeds and diet breaks? Okay, the structured higher calorie periods that are in these protocols. Well, I would say the evidence is still mixed. It's really hard to tease things out. There's the famous Matador study where they did the blocks, the intervals that we've talked about. I think it was like 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And it seems like they had better results, but it could just be an adherence thing. We've had studies that compare continuous dieting to dieting with breaks that did not find a difference between fat loss, muscle, metabolic rate. So I think the strongest case for a refeed and why we include them is adherence and the psychology of it, right? Knowing that refeed is coming up in 4 days, it helps you get through those 4 days. However, there may be a physiological benefit as well. And this is, again, where you will have to experiment and see. And this is why you may not need the full maintenance calories. That was my point. Like, if the only benefit is adherence, hey, this is Philip. Please give me 30 seconds of your time to mention 2 things. First, I'm so grateful that you listen to the show every week. I wouldn't keep going if it weren't for you. So thank you for being a listener. Second, if you enjoy the show, the most useful thing you can do is follow the show in whatever app you're in right now. Right now, only 36% of people who listen regularly have actually hit follow. So if you're one of the folks who hasn't yet, you're in good company, but I'd love to change that. When you follow, new episodes show up for you automatically, and it tells the app that everything you love about this show deserves to reach more people looking for help. That is it. 2 seconds, hit follow, and thank you truly. All right, back to the episode. Then that logic means you don't necessarily have to get fully up to maintenance on those days, right? Because the whole leptin argument, that has been debunked. So where does that leave metabolic adaptation itself in this conversation? Well, it's probably going to happen, but it's not going to be that big, and it's temporary anyway. So don't worry about it. In fact, when I run people through a 2 or 3 week rapid fat loss phase, we're not really even paying attention to what happens to our expenditure during that time, because you can't really have that level of precision. Even if you are using macro factor, it's too short of duration, and then you're done with the diet. What can you do with that information? You're not going to change your calories as a result, because you're already doing these big swings anyway from dieting to refeeds, right? The size of the adaptation on your metabolism tends to track with the size of the deficit, how much fat you lose, and the duration. But then it's going to bounce back. All of your metabolic rate's going to come back, and the only change will be if you are lighter on the scale than before the diet, you're going to burn fewer calories from that. But if you have more muscle, you'll burn more calories from that. So I would use the smallest deficit that gets you the loss that you want. But then in this case, what we're talking about today is that deficit being extremely high, but for a short duration for those who have trouble sticking with a longer, slow diet. That's really what I'm talking about. So who is this for? And who isn't it for? This is very important. And as always, I like to be direct here. So knowing that this protocol exists and works in a certain context is different from you should do it, because I know everybody listening, especially if you've heard this for the first time, you're hearing this for the first time, you're like, oh my God, I didn't know this exists. I don't want to do a crash diet, but yeah, I would love to do this rapid fat loss phase. I can drop like 5 pounds of fat. Let's do it. All right, here we go. So I think this is ideal if, for example, you carry a lot of body fat to start with. So it's kind of like you have fuel in your body already. I think it's great. If you are, quite overweight or even obese, perfect. Okay. I would say if you have a deadline, an event, a trip, a specific date, and you're just trying to do a quick cut for that, as much as I cringe a little bit on time-based constraints for these things, for some people, they're like, okay, I might as well do it the right way. And assuming you've already set up your nutrition properly ahead of time and you've been training, go for it. Don't do it though if you've never done a fat loss phase before and you haven't done all the things you're supposed to do for a fat loss phase, like strength training, okay? If you know yourself well enough that longer diets are really hard, but you actually can do really well for a short duration aggressively and be disciplined and all that, this could be perfect for you. A short block, clear finish line to you might be more sustainable, right? Over the macro period, like over the months, over the years, to have those short bursts in there. And I think the research backs it up. There's actually a study I found by Purcell in 2014 that was kind of counterintuitive. People losing weight rapidly were more likely to hit their target and less likely to drop out than a slow group. And it's because of this psychology of humans love to go after things and like to have events and goals. A clear, fast, defined push toward this goal, it kept more people in the game. And that finish line is motivating, right? So that's not just me theorizing about psychology, that we do have evidence for this. And then one more thing on the rate of loss, where guys like Brandon DeCruz talk about this a lot. The right rate of loss is not even necessarily fixed across a single cut. Now, a rapid fat loss phase is so short, you're not even worried about the rate of loss. You're just setting up the deficit and doing it and you're done. But if we're talking a little longer, like a mini cut or longer, you don't have to stick to the same thing the whole time. We're going to touch on this again in the end of the episode, because this is where I think people don't think out of the box, and we should, and it would make things easier. Also, though, you should not do an aggressive cut, okay? This is who it's not for. You should not do an aggressive cut or rapid fat loss phase if you have any history of disordered eating, period. Not worth the risk. Not worth the risk. I just had a call with somebody yesterday who has a history of very low calorie, binge restrict cycles. She's actually in a muscle building phase, which is awesome. Okay. And I said, let's crank that out for like 6 months. And then when you're ready for a fat loss phase, we're going to do it very moderate, and we're not going to do it for that long. And I said, who cares if it's like 5 pounds? It will prove to yourself you can do this in a sustainable way. So that's a different situation. She's not going to do rapid fat loss. I would never recommend it. If you're already pretty lean, it's hard as well, because I think you have a higher risk of muscle loss. If you cannot or will not hit that protein level while you're lifting hard, obviously you got to do that. It's probably not for you. In other words, if you already struggle to hit your protein not on a diet, you're not ready. You've got to get there. You have to be ready for it and go to maintenance and successfully build those skills, right? That's something we do in Eat More, Lift Heavy, just to throw my program out there, is build that skill, those skills of each of those things. How do we track? How do we eat our protein? How do we solve all the problems in our own lives first? And then we can go into fat loss, whether it's rapid or not. Now, if you're a lady, if you're a woman in perimenopause and menopause, a lot of you listening, you're over 40. I would say for some, the downside risk is higher. And for others, this is exactly ideal. It's really individualistic. Okay. When you're concerned about things like bone density and energy availability and stress and holding on to estrogen with lower, or holding on to muscle with lower estrogen, all that stuff, as long as you are lifting consistently and with the proper effort and volume, and you can hit the protein like we've already talked about, and you're the type of person who's not really super responsive to longer diets, give it a shot. Why not? Like, go for it. However, pushing energy too low is probably going to have an impact on your hormones like thyroid output, on your recovery, your sleep, your mood, your cycle, and it happens very fast. So my honest position is be very careful about setting yourself up for success during this, following the protocol the way it's supposed to be, doing the prerequisites. Don't be honest with yourself that you are ready for it. But it could be a great tool. So the difference between a proper aggressive fat loss phase, rapid fat loss phase that works well, is really in this level of precision, monitoring, protein, training, and then just watching how it works for you and tracking whatever you can so that next time you do it, you know what things you want to adjust. Should I go higher in the protein? Should I add another refeed? Should I go shorter or longer? Should I go more aggressive with the deficit, etc.? So to put the whole thing together, slow and moderate is still the right default for the vast majority of you here. I would say 80%, 90% of the time. Another 10% are probably better off with mini cuts. And then maybe 5% of you, 10% of you are good with these rapid fat loss phases. Just as a default, anybody can do the rapid fat loss phase or experiment with it, of course. But listen through this episode again and go download my guide and just walk through the protocol. witsandweights.com/free or use the link in the show notes. Get the rapid fat loss guide. Okay. So before we wrap up, I promised you a rule for setting your rate of loss that's out of the box that's going to help you out. And again, the resource today is a rapid fat loss guide. Go to witsandweights.com/free. Get the link in the show notes. If you need more help than that, reach out, go to eatmoreliftheavy.com and see how we can help you develop the skills needed to get ready for successful fat loss, whether it's done this way or not. That's eatmoreliftheavy.com. All right. Here is what I call the descending deficit. And it's something that I stumbled across randomly while working with clients and doing it for myself. And then I noticed folks like Brandon DeCruz and others talking about this. And it is stop picking just one rate of loss and trying to hold it the whole way. Instead, plan out a very, very aggressive rate of loss that then titrates down as you go. Because what it's going to do, it's going to feel like you're actually eating more food because you are eating more food as you go into the diet, which sounds counterintuitive, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Because at the start of a cut, your motivation's super high. You don't have any diet fatigue. You're carrying the most fat you're going to carry for the phase. Your muscle's at the lowest risk it will be for muscle loss. That's when you can push. That's when you can jack it up to say 1% of your body weight a week, or for some of you that are larger, even more than that. And then as you get leaner and the fatigue starts to build, you ease it off down to 0.75, down to 0.5% a week as you're getting lean. Now, these are for longer diets, maybe not, it's not for the rapid fat loss phase, but it's a little tip that I think is super helpful if you're planning a longer diet. You're doing it faster when it's easy, when it's safer, slower when it gets harder and risky. And then you actually, you're eating more food as you go. You're actually increasing the calories up into a smaller deficit. It's interesting, right? Psychologically. A lot of people do the opposite. They start kind of cautious. They dip their foot in. They're like, I'm going to go with a moderate deficit because I've heard I need to hold on onto my muscle. And then they just kind of like barely get going, right? And then they start to get tired. And, then you try to get more aggressive because you're making up for it. But now you're getting more metabolic adaptation and more diet fatigue. It's the wrong way to do it. So try very aggressive and taper off to less aggressive. And by the way, when you start very aggressive, if you find that you can stay there for a little bit longer, go for it, right? It'll kind of tell you where your limits are. All right, until next time, keep using your wits, lifting those weights. And remember, the right speed for fat loss isn't slow or fast. It's the one that matches what you're capable of to stick to it and get the result. I'm Philip Pape, and I'll talk to you next time here on the Wits and Weights podcast. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. Please consult your healthcare provider before making any health changes. Some links mentioned may be affiliate links, which means I may earn a commission at no extra cost to you if you choose to purchase.